73 years old, and the last sound I expected to hear on an August night in New Orleans was my own daughter's voice telling me I wasn't welcome in the house her father built with his bare hands. The rain hadn't started yet, but the sky had that sick yellow color it gets right before the Gulf decides to punish somebody. Tonight, that somebody was me. I stood on the front porch of the house on Bayou Road, the one with the cypress beams outside cut himself the summer Colette learned to walk, the one with the iron railings he welded on weekends because he said a Creole house without ironwork was just a box with opinions. I stood there watching my daughter close the door in my face like I was a census worker she didn't have time for. Welcome back to the channel. Grab your coffee, settle in, and remember, the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing. They just picked wrong. Leave a comment and make sure you subscribe. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this one ends. The humidity was the kind that sits on your chest like a second set of lungs you didn't ask for. Somewhere down the bayou, thunder rolled low and lazy like it was still deciding whether to commit. I had Alcide's old canvas tool bag in my hand, the one that still smelled like sawdust and salt air after 26 years, and I had absolutely no plan for what came next. But let me back up about 20 minutes, because you need the full picture before you start deciding who the villain is here. Spoiler: it isn't me. We'd been living together on Bayou Road for 3 years, Colette, her husband Darren, and me. It was supposed to be temporary, just until my hip healed after the replacement surgery. That was the arrangement. That was what we agreed on over gumbo at the kitchen table, while Darren smiled the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. Darren had a different arrangement in his head. I'd seen it building for months, the way you see a storm building over Lake Pontchartrain before it makes landfall. Little things at first. My reading chair moved from the living room to the back hallway without discussion. My prescriptions shifted from the kitchen counter to a plastic bin in the closet of the small bedroom, the one that used to be a sewing room before Colette cleaned it out for me. My place at the dining table quietly reassigned to Darren's laptop bag, and when I mentioned it, Colette looked at me like I was confused for expecting to sit where I'd sat for 40 years. Paper cuts. That's what they were. Little injuries, dressed up as logistics. Darren sold commercial real estate in the Garden District. He had that energy about him. The kind of man who could appraise a room the same way he'd appraise a building. Always calculating what things were worth and who was taking up space that could be monetized. He looked at that house on Bayou Road and didn't see the cypress beams Alcide had cut or the ironwork he'd welded on Saturdays. He saw a $500,000 property in a neighborhood that was finally gentrifying fast enough to make his spreadsheets interesting. I should have seen it coming. Maybe I did see it coming and just didn't want to believe my own daughter would let it arrive. That Friday night in August, I was in my room, the small one off the hallway that smelled like old thread and lavender sachets Colette's grandmother used to keep in the drawers. I was reading a library book about the history of Bayou Street. John, when I heard them in the kitchen. Not arguing exactly. Darren didn't argue. Darren presented. He had this way of laying out his position like a contractor, bidding on a job, calm, organized, reasonable enough that you almost forgot he was suggesting something monstrous. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The walls in that house are thin as excuses. Alcide always said he'd thicken them up someday. Someday never showed up. She doesn't need to be here, Darren. That voice. That practiced, patient, boardroom voice he used when he wanted Colette to feel like she was making a decision rather than receiving one. The property value alone, Colette. We're sitting on a gold mine, and she's in the back bedroom, collecting Medicare statements and library books. I could hear Colette breathing. The specific silence of a woman trying to find the middle of a road that didn't have one. She's my mother, Darren, and I respect that. But she's 73. She can barely walk to the mailbox, and she's sitting on $500,000 of real estate like a stubborn fossil. I called Renard and Associates last week. They can have a valuation done by Tuesday. The air left my lungs like it had somewhere better to be. Renard and Associates. He'd already called a broker. Not a conversation about maybe someday thinking about possibly discussing it. He'd picked up his phone, dialed a number, and started the process of selling the house my husband built, the house I'd raised my daughter in, the house where Alcide's handprints were still visible in the concrete of the back porch, because he'd pressed them there the day he finished it, and told me, "This is ours, Jean, until the river takes it back." And he'd done it without telling me, without asking me, without the basic human courtesy of looking me in the eye and admitting what he was planning. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to my son-in-law dismantle 40 years of my life with the confidence of a man who'd already run the numbers. And somewhere in that kitchen, my daughter was letting him. He wasn't finished. Darren never was. The man could build a case the way termites build damage, steady, patient, invisible until the whole structure gives. I heard a chair scrape. He was standing up now, probably doing that thing he does where he leans against the counter with his arms crossed like a prosecutor, delivering closing arguments to an audience of one. "Look, I'm not saying throw her out. I'm saying we have options. There's a place in Metairie, assisted living, nice courtyard, activities. Her Medicare would cover most of it. We sell this place, clear 500,000 easy, maybe more if we time it right. That's our future, Colette. That's the boys' college fund. That's everything. Our future. The boys' college fund." He was wrapping the sale of my home in the language of family, like a man putting a bow on a foreclosure notice. And then I heard the sound that broke something in me that I didn't know could still break at 73. Colette's voice, small, tired, the voice of a woman who had stopped fighting a current she should have been swimming against. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time." 5 words. 5 words from the girl I'd carried through Hurricane Georges in 1998 with one arm while holding a flashlight in the other. 5 words from the woman whose first steps happened on the same cypress floors she was now agreeing to sell. 5 words that hurt worse than anything Darren had ever said, because Darren was a stranger who'd married into my house. Colette was the house. I stood up. My hip protested the way it always did, sharp and personal, like it wanted me to know it hadn't forgotten the surgery. I didn't plan what happened next. I just moved. I walked down the hallway, past the framed photos on the wall. Alcide and me on our wedding day at St. Augustine Church. Colette's baptism, Father Trosclair holding her over the font, while Alcide grinned like a man who'd just built something he couldn't believe was real. The 4 of us at Jazz Fest in '96, the last photo taken before Alcide died the following summer. Photos that included me, smiling, present, visible, hanging on a wall in a house where I was being made invisible. I stepped into the kitchen. Darren saw me first. His face did that thing faces do when a presentation gets interrupted by the subject of the presentation. He uncrossed his arms. Colette turned around from the sink, and her eyes went wide and wet at the same time. "I heard enough," I said. No drama, no shaking voice. "I've been hearing enough for months, actually. I just kept hoping I was wrong." "Mama," Colette started. I held up my hand, the one with the arthritis in the knuckle. The one that had changed 10,000 diapers and signed 40 years of checks and held Alcide's hand in a hospital waiting room while they told me he wasn't coming back from the bayou. "Don't," I said. "Don't do the part where you cry, and I comfort you and we pretend he didn't just put a price tag on your father's house while your mother sat 30 feet away in a room the size of a closet." Colette's chin trembled. She looked at Darren. She looked at me. She looked at the floor, which was apparently the only surface in that kitchen that wasn't asking her to choose a side. Darren cleared his throat. The way men clear their throats when they're about to say something they should keep in their mouths. "Ms. Thibodeau, nobody's trying to hurt you. This is a financial conversation about what makes sense for the family going forward." "The family," I repeated. "The family that eats dinner at the table where I used to sit. The family that moved my reading chair into the hallway. That family." His jaw tightened. I watched him calculate, watched the real estate agent in him assess whether to double down or cut losses. He doubled down. Of course he did. Men like Darren always double down because they've never been on the losing side long enough to learn what folding looks like. "You're dead weight in a house worth more than everything you've ever earned," he said. "And every month you stay here is a month we're losing equity. That's not cruelty. That's math." Dead weight. He said it the way you'd describe a piece of furniture that needed hauling to the curb. Not a woman. Not a mother. Not the wife of the man who'd built every wall he was leaning against. Dead weight. The kitchen went quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when someone says the thing that can't be unsaid, and everyone in the room knows it. I looked at Colette, my girl, my only. The baby who used to fall asleep on Alcide's chest during thunderstorms, and pretended in the morning she hadn't. "Mama, maybe he has a point," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the last word. She knew. She knew what she was saying. She said it anyway. That was the one that landed. Not Darren's dead weight. I expected cruelty from Darren. You expect weather from a storm. But when your own daughter stands in the kitchen of the house where you taught her to make roux, in the house where her father pressed his handprints into the back porch concrete, and tells you that maybe the man who wants to sell it all has a point, that's not a paper cut anymore. That's a wound with your name on it. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I'm 73 years old, and I've buried a husband, survived 4 hurricanes, and taught 8th grade English for 30 years. I have been yelled at by 13-year-olds who thought Lord of the Flies was about actual flies. There is very little left in this world that can make me raise my voice. I looked at Darren. This house was built by hands better than yours, I said. And those hands are the only reason you have a roof tonight. Remember that when you're calculating equity. Then I looked at Colette. And you break my heart in ways he never could. Because he's a stranger. You're my blood. I walked back to my room. I picked up Alcide's canvas tool bag, the one I'd kept packed for 16 years. Old habit from a life I never told Colette about. I walked past those hallway photos one more time, past my wedding day, past the baptism, past Jazz Fest, and I opened the front door. The rain had started. Not gently. New Orleans rain doesn't believe in introductions. It arrives like it's late for something. Darren's voice came from behind me. Hard. Final. Don't expect us to come looking for you. I stepped off that porch into the August rain, Alcide's bag over my shoulder, my hip singing a hymn of protest with every step. The door closed behind me, and I heard the deadbolt turn. I didn't know it yet, but that door closing behind me was the last time anyone would ever call me deadweight, and in about 4 hours, Darren was going to find out exactly what 73 years of silence weighs when it finally decides to speak. There is a particular kind of rain that only New Orleans delivers in August. The kind that doesn't just fall on you. It interrogates you. Every drop has a question, and none of them are polite. I made it about 2 blocks down Bayou Road, before my hip reminded me that dramatic exits work better in the movies, where the leading lady isn't 73, with a titanium joint replacement, and a canvas bag full of documents she's been carrying for 16 years. The rain was coming sideways now, warm and heavy, the kind that smells like the Gulf and tastes like a decision you can't take back. The street was dark in that specific way. New Orleans gets dark when a storm is rolling in. Not just the absence of light, the presence of something else. The live oaks on Bayou Road have been standing for 200 years, and in a storm they don't sway. They lean. Like old women in church pews, who've heard the sermon before and aren't impressed but aren't leaving either. I walked past the Tran family's house, the one with the blue shutters Alcide helped install the summer before he died. Past the corner, where Celestine's granddaughter sells pralines on Saturday mornings from a folding table that's older than she is. Past the cafe on Esplanade where I used to drink chicory coffee every Sunday after Mass while Alcide pretended he liked the beignets that weren't as good as mine. Every block was a memory. Every house was a conversation I'd had with a man who'd been dead for 26 years, but somehow still hadn't left the neighborhood. Here's the thing about being old that nobody in their 40s understands yet. It's not the big losses that grind you down. You survive those. You bury a husband, you absorb it, you rebuild because the alternative is lying down and the floor is cold and you've got a daughter who needs you. The big losses have a strange mercy to them. They're so enormous that the world rearranges itself around them and people bring you casseroles and say things like, "She's so strong." It's the small indignities. the chair that moves, the place setting that disappears. The moment your own body agrees with the man in your kitchen who says you're dead weight, that's what gets you. The slow, quiet erasure of a person who is still very much here. My hip locked up outside the old hardware store on Moss Street. The one where Alcide used to buy cypress planks on Friday afternoons, hauling them home in the back of his truck, whistling something Cajun that he'd deny was Cajun because he said Thibodeau men don't whistle. They hum with ambition. I grabbed a light pole and stood there, breathing rain, trying to negotiate with a joint that had officially sided with Darren on the question of whether I should be walking anywhere tonight. And then I saw it. Through the rain. At the end of the path that runs along Bayou Street, John. Right where the water bends toward the lake. The bridge. Alcide's bridge. He built it in the spring of 1997. A small wooden footbridge over a narrow stretch of Bayou Street, John, where the neighborhood kids used to have to walk an extra half-mile to get to school. Nobody asked him to build it. The city certainly didn't commission it. Alcide just came home one Tuesday and said, "Gene, those kids are walking too far," and by Saturday, he had the pilings in. It took him 3 weekends. Cypress wood, because he said cypress doesn't rot, it just gets more stubborn. Hand-cut joints because he didn't trust machine cuts for something people were going to walk on. He finished it on a Sunday evening, stood on it with Colette on his shoulders, and told me, "A bridge is just a promise made out of wood, Gene. A promise that the other side is worth getting to." 4 months later, the flood came. August 1997. The bayou rose fast that year, faster than the warnings. Alcide was home. We were safe. The water wasn't coming for us. But it was coming for the Robichaud family. 3 houses down. The one with the twin girls who were 5 years old and afraid of the dark. Alcide heard the shouting from our front porch. He looked at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I'd been married to that man for 23 years. I knew what his face looked like when he'd already made a decision that wasn't a discussion. He walked into the water. He got the twins out. He got their mother out. He went back for the grandmother. The current had different plans. They found him 2 days later, a quarter-mile downstream, still wearing his work boots, one hand wrapped around a porch railing he'd grabbed, trying to keep his head above the waterline. He died the way he lived, building something, holding something together, reaching for someone who needed help getting to the other side. 26 years later, I was standing in the rain looking at his bridge, and it was still there, still standing, still carrying people across. The wood had grayed and the city had added metal railings at some point because liability. But the bones of it, the cypress pilings and the hand-cut joints, those were still Alcide. I sat down on the edge of that bridge. Not gracefully. My hip made sure of that. But I sat. And I let the rain fall on me. And for about 3 minutes I wasn't 73 with a bad hip sitting in a storm. I was 29. Standing in the kitchen of a house that wasn't finished yet, watching a man with sawdust in his hair tell me this is ours, Gene, until the river takes it back. My phone buzzed in the side pocket of Alcide's bag. I pulled it out. The screen was wet but functional. I didn't call Colette. I didn't call anyone who would make me explain myself tonight. I called Sister Marguerite. Sister Marguerite Delacroix, 26 years in the Ursuline convent on Chartres Street. She'd been the one who sat with me the night Alcide died, in the hospital on Tulane Avenue, while I tried to remember how to breathe in a world that had just lost the man who'd built everything I stood on. She brought me café au lait and a rosary, and didn't say a single word for 4 hours. She just sat there. Some people fill silence because they're uncomfortable. Marguerite filled it because she understood that silence, done right, is a kind of holding. She picked up on the second ring. The way people pick up when they've been waiting for a call they hoped wasn't coming. "Gene," she said. "It's almost 10. 9:47, I corrected. There was a pause. "Where are you?" "Alcide's bridge." I fell a little. "You fell?" Mostly I just sat down harder than I planned. Another pause. I could hear her already moving. Keys. A door. The particular sound of a woman who has spent 26 years in a convent and still moves like someone who knows exactly where the car is parked. Jean, 26 years I kept your secret. Her voice had that quality it got when she'd moved past suggestion into declaration. Tonight, I'm breaking that promise. I opened my mouth to argue. The rain made the argument for me. A gust drove it straight into my face like a rebuttal I hadn't prepared for. Through the phone, I heard the engine of the old convent van turn over. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in the place where you keep the things you've always known but never admitted, I understood that everything was about to change. Stay on the line, Marguerite said. I'm coming. The rain kept falling on Alcide's bridge. And somewhere under 26 years of silence, a promise made out of wood was about to become a promise made out of truth. The headlights of the Ursuline convent van cut through the rain on Bayou Street John like a pair of answers arriving before I'd finished asking the questions. The van was old, a 2004 Ford Econoline that had survived Katrina, 2 transmission replacements, and Sister Marguerite's personal interpretation of what a speed limit meant during an emergency. Tonight qualified. She pulled up to the bridge and stepped out without an umbrella. Marguerite never carried umbrellas. She said they implied a lack of trust in the timing of weather, which was really just a lack of trust in God. And she wasn't about to insult the Almighty over a little water. She was 70 years old, 5'2", built like a woman who'd spent her life carrying other people's burdens without ever calling them that. She looked at me sitting on the edge of Alcide's bridge, soaked through, one hand on my hip, and she had the audacity to almost smile. You look like a drowned saint, she said. I've looked worse. She tilted her head, considering. 1997 comes to mind. That landed where she meant it to. The night Alcide died. I'd looked considerably worse that night, sitting in a hospital hallway on Tulane Avenue, still wearing the dress I'd been cooking in when the phone rang, unable to form a sentence that didn't start with his name and end with a question mark. Can you walk? She asked. I walked 2 miles in a hurricane with a bad hip, and my dignity mostly intact. Yes, I can walk. Mostly intact, she repeated. Let's not push it. She helped me to the van, not like a nurse, like a partner. Hand on my elbow, steady pressure, no commentary. Marguerite understood the difference between helping someone and making them feel helped, which is a distance most people never learn to navigate. I settled into the passenger seat. The van smelled like candle wax and old hymnals, and whatever industrial cleaner the convent used on everything, including, I suspected, their spiritual doubts. She cranked the heat without asking. Even in August in New Orleans, when you've been sitting in the rain for 30 minutes, heat is a kindness. She pulled out onto Moss Street, windshield wipers working overtime, and for about 2 minutes, she just drove. That was one of her gifts. The woman could be present without being loud about it. We moved through the Treme in the rain, past the Backstreet Cultural Museum, past the old Creole cottages on Governor Nichols that had survived everything this city had thrown at them for 200 years, past Street, Augustine Church, where Alcide and I had been married in 1974 and where Colette had been baptized the following spring. You want to tell me what happened? Marguerite said finally, her eyes still on the road. Darren happened. She nodded, the way a woman nods when she's heard a name used as a diagnosis before. He called a broker, I said. Renard and Associates. Behind my back. He wants to sell the house. Her hands tightened on the wheel. Just slightly. Enough. And Colette? I looked out the window at the rain, erasing the city one street at a time. Colette stood there and told me maybe he has a point. The silence in that van had the weight of a cathedral ceiling. I could feel Marguerite processing, and when Sister Marguerite processed, things happened. Not fast, not loud, but irreversible. She picked up her phone from the console. One hand on the wheel, eyes still forward, the posture of a woman who'd made a decision and wasn't interested in discussing it. Who are you calling? I asked. Father Antoine. Marguerite. She held up one finger. The universal gesture for I love you, but I'm not stopping. The phone rang twice. Father Antoine picked up the way priests pick up phones at 10 at night, with the cautious optimism of a man who hopes it's a wrong number, but suspects it's not. Antoine, it's Marguerite. I could hear the rain hitting the van roof like applause for something that hadn't happened yet. The woman who built half this parish just got thrown into a hurricane by her own family. She's with me. She's safe. But I need you to open the shelter on Esplanade, and I need you to call Deacon Willis. A pause on the other end. Then Father Antoine's voice, low and steady. How many people should I call? Marguerite looked at me. Then she looked back at the road. Everyone, she said. Call everyone. She hung up and set the phone down like she'd just placed a bet she knew she was going to win. I stared at her. Marguerite, I don't want a spectacle. You built 14 after-school programs, Jean. You rebuilt 8 houses after Katrina. You put 203 children through college. She turned onto Esplanade Avenue, the wipers beating a rhythm that sounded a lot like a countdown. You don't get to be invisible anymore. Not tonight. Not after what they did. I wanted to be angry. I genuinely tried to find some outrage, some righteous objection to this 70-year-old nun, dismantling 26 years of careful anonymity with a single phone call. But the truth was sitting in that warm van, listening to the rain, watching the streetlights blur through the wet windshield. I couldn't find it. 26 years, I honored your silence, Jean. Her voice dropped, not to a whisper, to something deeper, to the voice she used during Vespers when she was talking to someone above the ceiling. But I will not honor a world that throws you into a storm and calls it mercy. I didn't have an answer for that. Some sentences arrive fully formed and perfect, and there's nothing to do but let them stand. We drove through the French Quarter, past Jackson Square where the fortune tellers had packed up hours ago, past the cathedral where the bells had already rung 10, past the streets that smelled like jasmine and rain, and the particular ghosts that New Orleans keeps on staff year-round. And then Marguerite turned onto Esplanade, and I saw it. The shelter. The Esplanade Avenue Community Storm Shelter, the one I'd funded in 2009 after Gustave, the one whose generator I'd replaced in 2017, because the old one couldn't keep the lights on during a Category 2. And I had a thing about children sitting in the dark during hurricanes. It was lit up like Christmas in August. Cars lined both sides of the street. People stood outside in the rain. Not a handful of people. Hundreds. Coats and rain jackets and umbrellas and flashlights. Standing in the parking lot and spilling onto the sidewalk and onto the neutral ground of Esplanade Avenue in the middle of a Friday night storm that had absolutely no business bringing this many people together. I stared. When did you? I started. I made a call, Marguerite said quietly. Then it got away from me. Got away from you? These things have a way. She paused. The wipers beat once, twice. There are 2 news vans, Jean, WDSU, and Fox 8. I want you to be prepared. I looked down at my clothes, soaked through. My blouse sticking to me like a second opinion I hadn't asked for. My shoes squelching. Alcide's canvas bag on my lap, dark with rain. Marguerite. I look like a drowned cat. She turned to me. And for the first time that night, she smiled. Full. The kind of smile that nuns aren't supposed to have, but the good ones always do. You look like a woman who built bridges in a hurricane, she said. There's a difference. Getting inside took some doing. Marguerite wanted to call for medical. My hip had swollen enough that walking was more of a philosophical debate than a physical act, but I waved her off. There was no version of this moment that included me being carried across a threshold like a bride, with worse knees and no groom. Not tonight. I walked in slowly. Marguerite at my left shoulder, Alcide's canvas bag over my right, and my soaked blouse doing the best it could. The room went quiet when the door opened. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet. The other kind. The kind a room gets when it's been holding its breath, and something finally gives it permission to exhale. I recognized faces immediately. Thierry Robichaud, 28 years old now, standing near the front in a rain jacket that probably cost more than his first month's rent in the lower ninth before Katrina took everything. He'd been 5 when the storm hit. One of the twins Alcide had pulled out of the rising water the night the bayou decided his life was the price of theirs. I'd paid for Thierry's schooling from kindergarten through Tulane's architecture program. He'd designed the renovation of this very shelter 2 years ago without ever knowing that the woman who funded it was the same woman who funded him. Next to him stood old Celestine Broussard, 80 years old, carrying a cast-iron pot of gumbo she had somehow produced in the middle of a Friday night hurricane, because Celestine believed that no crisis in Louisiana had ever been made worse by a roux. Behind them, teachers from the after-school programs, parents whose children had gone through the carpentry apprenticeship, teenagers who didn't know me, but had been brought by people who did. And in the back, 3 women from the Alcide Thibodeau Scholarship Committee, who had sent me handwritten thank you notes every June for 26 years, addressed to Madame Pont, care of a post office box on Decatur Street. Then someone started clapping. I am not going to pretend I handled that with dignity. I'm 73 years old. I'd just been called dead weight by a man who sells other people's houses for a living. My hip was the size of a cantaloupe, and a room full of people who knew my dead husband's name were applauding me in the middle of a hurricane. I looked at the ceiling. Old trick. Keeps things from spilling over. All right, I said. Loud enough to carry. All right now, everybody go home before this storm gets any ideas. Alcide would drag every one of you inside by your collars and then make you sand something until the weather passed. Laughter. Real laughter. The kind that cracks tension like a window letting in air. Thierry stepped forward. Madame Pont, he said, and his voice broke on the second word. I put my hand on his cheek, the way I'd done when he was 6 and afraid of the dark in temporary housing after the storm. You turned out all right, I said. Your mama would be proud. They got me into the back office. Celestine set the gumbo pot on the desk with the authority of a woman who has never once considered the possibility that her cooking might not be needed. You eat, she said. It was not a suggestion. The coffee appeared next. Chicory, dark, strong enough to file a restraining order. Through the office's small interior window, I could see Thierry talking to the WDSU reporter, saying words like 26 years and 14 programs, and she never told anyone. And on the wall directly across from where I sat, through that window, I could see it, the photograph. Alcide, taken in 1996. Standing in front of the bridge on Bayou Street. John, wearing his carpenter's clothes, hammer in his right hand, and a grin that made you believe every problem in the world could be solved with the right piece of cypress and enough stubbornness. Beneath the photograph, carved into dark Louisiana oak in letters I had chosen myself, were the words I'd carried for 26 years, built by Madame Pont. In love, in labor, in his name, forever. Marguerite stepped into the office and closed the door. She had her phone in her hand. She's on her way, she said. You called Colette. I called Colette. What did you tell her? I told her that her mother was found walking alone in the rain on Bayou Road, and that she needed to come to the storm shelter immediately. Marguerite paused. I may have left out several details. Several? Most of them. How long? I asked. 15 minutes. Maybe 10 if she runs lights. I sat back in that chair and thought about what I was going to say to my daughter. Here's what I came up with. Nothing. Not because I was angry, but because some things, when the time finally comes, don't need words. Some things explain themselves. I didn't know it yet, but 14 miles away, on a television in a living room I had paid for with 30 years of teaching salary, Darren was watching WDSU with the specific expression of a man whose carefully constructed reality was crumbling faster than he could calculate the losses. I heard the front door open. The crowd went quiet again. Footsteps. Fast ones. The footsteps of a woman who'd spent the entire drive over rearranging every assumption she'd ever made about who her mother was. I picked up my chicory coffee and waited. Colette appeared in the doorway, eyes wild and wet, and searching. They found me first. Then they moved past me, through the interior window, to the photograph, to Alcide, to the carpenter's clothes, to the hammer, to the grin, to the words carved beneath him, built by Madame Pont. In love, in labor, in his name, forever. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her hand found the door frame, the way a person finds a wall when the floor moves. That's, she stopped, swallowed. That's Daddy. Mama. On the wall. That's. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Behind her, Darren stood with the pallor of a man who had just tried to sell a house built by a ghost who was more alive than anyone in that family had understood. I set my coffee down and looked at my daughter. Sit down, baby, I said. Your father has a story he's been waiting 26 years for you to hear. I'm just the one telling it. Colette sat in the chair across from me. The same chair Thierry used during foundation budget meetings. The same chair that had held teachers and principals and city council members over the years. My daughter sat in it like it was a witness stand, and I suppose in a way it was. I folded my hands on the desk. The arthritis in my knuckles had its own opinion about the evening, but I ignored it the way I'd been ignoring inconvenient truths for 26 years. The Alcide Thibodeau Community Bridge Foundation, I said. Incorporated March 1998. 8 months after your father died. Colette said nothing. Her eyes were still pulling back to the window, back to the photograph, back to me. Your father's life insurance paid out in January of '98. $67,000. I didn't touch a penny of it personally. Not one penny, Colette. I put it in a trust, and I added to it every month from my teaching salary for 30 years. Some months, it was $50. Some months, it was $300. Every month, it was his. I watched her face do the math she wasn't prepared for. 14 after-school programs across 6 zip codes in New Orleans, I continued. The voice I used was the same one I'd used for 30 years in a classroom. Steady. Clear. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it has facts. 15 carpentry apprenticeship programs, because your father believed that a man who could build with his hands would never be homeless in his heart. 203 scholarships for children from families affected by flooding. Kids who grew up in neighborhoods like this one. Kids who didn't have what you had. Her breathing had changed. Shallow. Fast. The breathing of a woman whose world was rearranging itself without asking permission. This building, I said, gesturing toward the window where Alcide's photograph watched us both, purchased with foundation money in 2001. Roof replaced after Katrina in 2006. Generator upgraded in 2017 because the children in the shelter programs were sitting in the dark during hurricanes, and I have a thing about that. 8 houses, I said. 8 houses rebuilt after Katrina with foundation funds. Families who lost everything. Families whose children were sleeping in cars. Your father's money put roofs back over their heads. I paused. Let it settle the way good seasoning settles into a roux. You don't rush it. You let the heat do the work. 4 community storm shelters funded across Orleans Parish, including the one you're sitting in right now. Colette's hands were shaking. She'd pressed them together in her lap like she was praying, which maybe she was. The name on every foundation document, I said, is Madame Pont, your father's name for me. He started calling me that the summer he built the bridge on Bayou Street. John, because I kept standing on it every evening watching the sunset, and he said I loved that bridge more than I loved him. I told him that wasn't true. He said, prove it. So I named everything I ever built after him instead. A sound came out of Colette that I hadn't heard since she was a little girl. Not a word, not a cry exactly. Something between the two. The sound a person makes when they finally understand the size of what they've been standing on without knowing it. Why? She whispered. Why didn't you tell me? I met her eyes. Because you would have told Darren. And Darren would have made it a conversation about assets and inheritance and what percentage of a dead man's legacy belongs on a spreadsheet. And this, I gestured again toward the window, toward Alcide's grin, toward the sound of Thierry's voice still talking to the reporter outside. This was never about assets, baby. This was about the man who built you a crib with his own hands the night you were born because the one we ordered hadn't arrived, and he said his daughter wasn't sleeping in a drawer. Colette put her face in her hands. I let her have that. Some things need a minute before they can stand up straight. Outside the office, I could hear the building breathing. Piety Street teachers talking to parents. The reporter asking Celestine about the gumbo, and Celestine explaining that gumbo was not a subject she discussed with people who held microphones unless they were prepared to take notes. Somewhere out there, a camera was rolling and a story was being told that didn't need embellishment because the truth was already better than anything anyone could invent. "Mama, I'm sorry." Colette looked up. Her eyes were ruined. Beautiful and ruined. "I'm sorry I let him say that. I'm sorry I didn't stop him. I should have. I should have stood in front of you and told him to leave before I ever let him call you that word. I let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. I know, baby." I said it gently. The way you say things to someone whose guilt is already doing more damage than your anger ever could. A voice came from the doorway. Darren. He'd been standing there long enough to have heard most of it. Maybe all of it. His face had the look of a man who'd been adding numbers all night, and just realized the decimal point was in the wrong place. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was thin. "How could I have known? Nobody told me. You can't blame me for something I didn't know about." I looked at him. Steady. The way you look at a man when you want him to hear every syllable land. "You didn't need to know what I built, Darren. You just needed to know how to treat the woman who raised the person you married. That doesn't require a foundation. That doesn't require a spreadsheet. That requires basic human decency, and you failed at it in a way that I cannot make smaller for you no matter how much you'd like me to." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. Good. Some silences are earned. Colette's phone began buzzing. Not once. Continuously. She pulled it out and stared at the screen. 14 missed calls. Her cousin in Metairie. 2 coworkers. Her best friend from college. Darren's mother. Darren's sister. And a text from a neighbor on Bayou Road that read, and I know this because Colette read it to me twice to make sure I had it right. "I just saw your mama on WDSU. They're saying she built the entire storm shelter network. They're saying she's been funding schools for 26 years. Colette? Is this real?" I said nothing. This was the part where I was supposed to feel triumphant. The woman whose son-in-law had called her dead weight was watching the 10 o'clock news discover exactly how wrong his math was. What I actually felt was tired and old and a little bit sad that it had taken a hurricane to get my daughter to look at me clearly. But underneath all of that, quiet and warm and stubborn as Alcide himself, was something that felt a lot like peace. I reached into his canvas tool bag, the one that still smelled like sawdust and salt air, and I set a craft envelope on the desk between us. Thick, rubber-banded, my attorney's return address in the corner. Colette stared at it. Darren stared at it. "There's one more thing," I said. The craft envelope sat on the desk between us like a verdict waiting to be read. Thick, rubber-banded. The return address of my attorney, on Barron Street, printed in the corner in letters small enough to be polite but clear enough to be permanent. "What is that?" Colette asked. "That," I said, "is my updated will, signed and filed 10 days ago." I watched her face. Then I watched Darren's face, which was considerably more interesting, because it was the face of a man who had just spent the last 45 minutes learning that the woman he'd called dead weight had quietly built an empire and was now realizing that the empire had paperwork. "The house on Bayou Road," I said. "The one your father built. The one I paid off in 2002 with 30 years of teaching salary. The one I handed you the deed to when I moved in 3 years ago because I thought family meant something in that kitchen." I paused. Let the silence do what silence does when it's earned. I've retitled it back into the Foundation's name. It will become a living museum of Creole culture and a traditional carpentry training center. Alcide's tools will be displayed in the front room. Students will learn to cut cypress joints the way he did, by hand, because he never trusted machines for something people were going to stand on. The color left Darren's face like equity, leaving a bad investment. "You can't do that," he said. His voice had that thin, desperate quality it gets when a man realizes the numbers don't work in his favor. "I can. I did. My attorney filed the transfer 10 days ago. It's done, Darren." Colette was staring at the envelope. Not at me. Not at Darren. At the envelope, like it contained the answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. "Darren has 45 days to vacate," I said. "That's in the paperwork. My attorney sent the formal notice this afternoon, which means it was waiting in your mailbox when you were busy calling me dead weight in the kitchen. I let that land. It landed hard. I could see it in the way Darren's jaw moved without producing words, the way a machine moves when the gears strip. You wanted to sell that house, Darren. I kept my voice level. The way you keep a table level when one leg is shorter. Constant, quiet adjustment. I'm keeping it. Just not for you. For every kid in this neighborhood who needs to learn that building something with your hands is worth more than selling something with your mouth. Colette looked up. Mama, what about me? I looked at my daughter, my girl, my only. The baby whose crib Alcide built with his own hands the night she was born because the one they'd ordered hadn't arrived. You, I said, have a choice to make. And you have about 45 days to make it. Your father built that house with love in every joint. I won't let it become someone's commission check. What you do with your marriage is your business. What I do with your father's legacy is mine. I stood up then. Slowly. My hip protested every inch of it, and I did not care. Outside the office door, I could hear the reporter asking Thierry about the foundation's history. I could hear his answer, calm and proud, the voice of a young man who understood exactly what had been built and who had built it. I turned back to Colette. She hadn't moved. The envelope sat between us like a bridge. A different kind of bridge. The kind built out of truth rather than cypress, but a bridge all the same. I am not dead weight, I said. I never was. And the next person who builds a life on my foundation while calling me worthless is going to find out exactly what this family is actually worth, and none of it will be left to them. I walked past her, through the door, and out into the main hall of the shelter. The reporter was waiting near the front entrance. Young woman, serious face, WDSU microphone. The camera behind her still rolling. Marguerite stood to the side with the quiet pride of a woman who had kept a secret for 26 years and was finally allowed to stop carrying it. I walked over, my bad hip and my soaked blouse and all 26 years of silence walking with me. And I stood in front of that camera, somewhere across New Orleans, on a television in a living room on Bayou Road, in the house that Alcide built. A man named Darren was about to watch the 10 o'clock news introduce the dead weight he'd just thrown into a hurricane. I hoped he was sitting in my chair. Mrs. Thibodeau, the reporter said. Can you tell us about the foundation? I looked straight into the camera. 73 years old, I said. One bad hip, a soaked blouse and a canvas bag that belonged to my husband. Not a single dollar of my own money spent on myself. Because every dollar was always his. Every nail was his. Every board, every scholarship, every child who learned to build something with their hands instead of tearing things down with their words. It's a love story, I said. Been going on 26 years. Started the night my husband died saving strangers in a flood, and it hasn't stopped yet. Behind me, through the office door I'd left open, I heard a sound. Colette crying. Not the polished kind. The kind a woman does when she finally understands the size of what she almost lost. Good. Let her cry. Some lessons have to cost something before they stick. Alcide would have agreed with me. He always did, in the end. The rain slowed on Esplanade Avenue. Then it stopped. The sky cracked open just enough to let a sliver of moonlight fall across the neutral ground, and for a moment the whole street looked silver, like something washed clean. And somewhere over Bayou Street John, a wooden bridge built by a carpenter who died saving strangers, was still standing, still carrying people across the water. 26 years of weather. 26 years of floods and hurricanes and the kind of storms that don't show up on radar. And it was still there. Cypress pilings and hand-cut joints, stubborn as the man who built them, holding steady in the dark. You know, there's a kind of love that doesn't need an audience. The kind that builds quietly, in the hours nobody sees, with hands that never stop working even after the person they belong to is gone. That's the love God put into the world when he decided that human beings were worth the trouble. The kind that carries people across the water when the water rises. The kind that holds, even when holding costs everything. And maybe that's the lesson here. Maybe the bridges that matter most are the ones nobody sees until the storm comes. The ones built in silence, in faith, in the stubborn belief that the other side is worth getting to. God sees those bridges. He always has. And He has a way of making sure that the people who build them are never, not ever, truly invisible. Because the Almighty keeps His own records, and they are considerably more accurate than any spreadsheet a man in a kitchen ever put together. The rain stopped falling on Bayou Road. The cameras stopped rolling. And somewhere, a woman in carpenter's dust, a woman who loved a bridge, and a man and an entire city full of strangers, was finally, fully, irreversibly known. That was enough. That was more than enough. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone who built quietly and loved fiercely and never asked for a single thing in return, share it. Share it with the person who needs to hear it tonight. Leave a comment below and tell me about the bridge builder in your life, the one who carried you across the water when nobody else would. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, because we've got more of them, and every single one is worth the telling.